He led his country back from the brink of defeat in the Second World War and, together with U.S. President Roosevelt and Soviet Union leader Stalin, determined the Allied war strategy. During the War of Independence, he spent 2 months in Cuba and worked as a correspondent for the Daily Graphic newspaper in London. In 1896, he traveled to India with the military unit he was attached to and served as a journalist and soldier on the Northwestern Front. The news he published in 1898 under the title The Story of the Malakand Field Force attracted wide attention, and this event marked the beginning of his writing career, which he continued intermittently thereafter. Bored with his monotonous military life in India, Churchill resigned from the army in 1899 to enter politics and become a writer. As soon as he returned to England, he ran in the by-elections in Oldham for the Conservative Party, but could not be elected. He then worked as a correspondent for the Morning Post newspaper published in London between 1899 and 1902, covering the South African War. During this war, he gained fame for his role in the rescue of a train ambushed by the Boers, but was himself captured by the Boers. However, he escaped from the prison camp a month later and returned to England as a hero. In 1900, this time he won the elections in Oldham and managed to enter the Parliament. Following his father's example in politics, Churchill soon became one of the most prominent members of the House of Commons. In 1904, Colonial Minister Joseph Chamberlain's open advocacy of customs duties caused a dilemma in the Conservative government, and when the pro-free trade Churchill pioneered the establishment of the Free Food Union, he was ostracized by both the pro-customs and the indecisive party leadership. As a result, Churchill left the Conservative Party and joined the Liberal Party in the same year. He drew attention with his harsh outbursts against Balfour and Chamberlain, and the radical elements in his political life began to come to the fore with the influence of fellow politicians such as David Lloyd George and John Morley. In the 1906 general elections, Churchill was re-elected to Parliament with a large margin of votes from the Manchester region and became the Under-Secretary of State for Colonial Affairs in the new government formed by the Liberals. In 1908, he was appointed Minister of Commerce in the Herbert H. Asquith government and became a member of the cabinet. As Trade Minister, he spearheaded the movement among the Liberals from laissez-faire to social reform. He completed the work begun by his predecessor Lloyd George on legislation limiting the working day for miners to 8 hours, established trade boards with the power to set the minimum wage, and set up state-run employment centers to combat unemployment. These centers formed the basis of the unemployment insurance system, a prerequisite for the modern social welfare state. However, when this program of high taxes led to the House of Lords rejecting the 1909 budget, Churchill became Lloyd George's closest ally as he sought to limit the powers of the House of Lords. He gained widespread public support through his campaigning in the 2 general elections of 1910, and during the passage of the Parliament Act limiting the power of the House of Lords in the House of Commons in 1911. Thus, Churchill was appointed Home Secretary in the cabinet, and although he made important reforms in the prison system during his ministry, he had to deal mostly with industrial unrest and strikes. When he became the Minister of the Navy in October 1911, he aimed to make the Navy ready for war at any time and planned to establish a naval battle fleet with the help of retired Admiral Sir John Fisher, the inventor of the dreadnought. He successfully advocated the largest naval budget in British history in the cabinet to gain the upper hand against the growing German naval power. Against traditional views on Ireland, he supported the Liberals' policy of autonomy, and in 1912, in the face of pre-unification opposition, he defended the Irish Administrative Autonomy Act. Preparing for the First World War, Churchill ordered the mobilization of the Navy on August 2, 1914. In 1915, Churchill advocated the Dardanelles campaign as a way out of the stalemate on the Western Front, despite the opposition of Admiral Fisher. Churchill, who argued that the Dardanelles could be crossed with the Navy and then easily reach Istanbul, led to the historic defeat of the Allied army when the Turks put up a much more successful defense than expected. Churchill, seen as the architect of this failure, was subjected to heavy political criticism. Caught unprepared for these criticisms, which increased even more with Fisher's resignation, Churchill did not take part in the formation of the first coalition government and was removed from the Ministry of the Navy at the insistence of the Conservatives. Resigning from the government in November 1915, Churchill returned to military service and served as a lieutenant colonel in the Royal Scottish 6th Regiment in France. However, after the battalion he served in was disbanded in 1916, he did not take another position and re-entered Parliament as an independent MP. Although the Gallipoli report published in March 1917 stated that he was not solely responsible for the defeat, the Conservatives' attitude towards him did not change and Churchill remained in the background in a number of bureaucratic positions until the end of the war. Churchill, who became Secretary of State for War in January 1919, developed the 10-year rule, which stipulated that Britain should not participate in any major war for the next 10 years by cutting military spending. However, his main concern during this period was the Allied intervention in Russia. Despite the fierce opposition of the workers, Churchill, who was anti-Bolshevik, took advantage of the division in the cabinet to pass a resolution for a more effective and prolonged British intervention. In 1921, Churchill, who became the Minister of Colonies and took care of the British-mandated administrations in the Middle East, created a structure based on the support of the Air Force and the appointment of administrators in line with British interests instead of keeping costly British forces in the region. In 1922, he published a report recognizing Palestine as the national home of the Jews, but also recognizing the rights of the Arabs. In the fall of 1922, when the Turkish army, which had successfully concluded the War of Independence, moved against the British forces in the Dardanelles, Churchill advocated resistance, but this idea was not accepted by his government. The ensuing political collapse resulted in the collapse of the coalition government, and one of the biggest losers was Churchill, who suffered a heavy defeat in the following elections. When he was out of politics, Churchill devoted himself to painting and literature, and although he was no more than a talented amateur in painting, he was successful in his literary endeavors. His autobiographical history of the war, The World Depression, was his most successful work during this period. In 1924 he rejoined the Conservative Party and won an easy victory in Epping in the general election of the same year. He accepted Baldwin's offer and became finance minister. However, Churchill, who had never been a financier, brought back the gold standard, which led to economic stagnation, unemployment and a general strike in 1926. However, Churchill, who perceived the strike as a semi-revolutionary attempt, absolutely rejected a negotiated settlement. When the government fell in 1929, Churchill, who had advocated a conservative-liberal merger, strongly opposed Baldwin's decision to accept a minority Labour government. The dispute between them escalated over this and Churchill resigned from the shadow cabinet after Baldwin agreed to the Round Table Conference with Indian leaders. In 1935, he also launched an intensive campaign against the bill granting India Dominion status. He supported the national government of 1931 but did not take part in it. At this stage he continued to write and wrote Marlborough, His Life and Times. Meanwhile, he argued persistently to the government and opposition that Hitler's Germany was a growing threat and needed to be taken seriously. In 1935, Churchill was appointed as a member of the Secret Committee on Air Defense by Prime Minister Baldwin, although he was not a member of the cabinet, and during the crisis that led to the abdication of Edward VIII, he opposed Baldwin and defended the king. After Baldwin was replaced by Neville Chamberlain as Prime Minister, Churchill's ties with the Conservatives worsened, and while his information about Germany's aggressive plans was consistently accurate, his warnings were ignored. When German pressure intensified on Czechoslovakia, Churchill insisted that the government issue a joint declaration with France and the Soviet Union, and when the Munich Agreement was signed with Hitler in 1938, ceding Czechoslovakia to the Nazis, Churchill declared that this represented a real defeat. Meanwhile, public opinion began to recognize Churchill as the spokesman of the nation and pressed for his reinstatement, but Prime Minister Chamberlain ignored the pressure. However, when Britain declared war on Germany on September 3, 1939, Chamberlain appointed Churchill to his old post as Secretary of the Navy. Despite his best efforts, Churchill failed to mobilize the Anglo-French Entente during the lull before the German invasion of Norway in April 1940, and the failure of the Narvik and Trondheim campaigns, which relied on naval support, was reminiscent of the Gallipoli campaign in the First World War, but this time Chamberlain was blamed. Following the invasion of Norway, Germany's invasion of the Benelux countries on May 10, 1940 was a great shock for Britain, and Churchill became Prime Minister instead of Chamberlain, who resigned. Forming a coalition government representing all tendencies except the extreme right and left, Churchill assumed the post of Defence Minister as well as the Speaker of the House of Commons. In order to make decisions quickly, the government was headed by a 5-person war cabinet, but all groups and parties were represented in the government under his supervision. This structure was maintained throughout the war. Prime Minister Churchill was directly involved in the course of the war. His war policy and his good relations with U.S. President Roosevelt made Churchill one of the most important statesmen in British history. On May 13, 1940, Churchill made his first speech as Prime Minister in the House of Commons, saying that he had nothing to offer but blood, struggle, tears and sweat. Churchill's war policy was based on the principle that every British citizen, regardless of political affiliation, should join the struggle against the enemy Hitler's Germany in unity and solidarity. 2 weeks after coming to power, he passed a law in Parliament placing persons, services and property at the King's disposal. This was the largest emergency power granted to any government in modern British history. After the Allied defeat and the evacuation of Dunkirk by British forces, Churchill warned Parliament that the invasion was a real danger and must be met with decisive resistance. In the middle of the war, with a cigar in his mouth and a victory sign with his hand, Churchill walked around the defense lines and made realistic statements to the public without losing his unique sense of humor. Sometimes having to take decisions that led to bitter consequences and controversy, Churchill had the French fleet bombed in order to prevent it from falling into Hitler's hands. When the threat of invasion reached its peak, British power in the eastern Mediterranean was increased and forces were sent to Greece. However, the subsequent evacuation of British forces from Crete was perceived as a new Gallipoli defeat, and Churchill was heavily criticized in Parliament. In these difficult days, the U.S. provided military aid to Britain, but there was no alliance between the two countries. However, the solidarity between the two countries was further strengthened with the meeting of Churchill and Roosevelt in Newfoundland, Canada in August 1941 and the subsequent announcement of the Atlantic Charter, which established common principles between the U.S. and Britain. In the post-war period, Churchill's main interest was foreign policy. In March 1946, in Fulton, Missouri, Churchill explained his views on the post-war world order to President Truman and stated that Britain and the United States should unite as guardians of peace against Soviet communism, which divided Europe with an iron curtain. Churchill, who also advocated the establishment of a European Union, took initiatives to establish the Council of Europe in Zurich in September 1946 and attended the first meeting of the Council in Strasbourg in 1949. The Conservative Party won the elections held in October 1951 and Churchill became Prime Minister for the second time. During this period, domestic problems did not attract Churchill's attention much, only the nationalization of the steel industry, which had been nationalized by the Labour Party, and the transfer of road transport back to the private sector. In January 1952, he went to Washington and then to Ottawa in an attempt to mend relations that he believed had deteriorated under Labour. The visit to Washington allayed U.S. public concerns about Britain's withdrawal from the Korean War, harmonized approaches to German rearmament, and resulted in the acceptance of U.S. command east of the Atlantic, much to Churchill's displeasure. In 1953, Churchill received the Order of the Garter from Queen Elizabeth II and also the Nobel Prize for Literature. He welcomed his former comrade-in-arms Dwight D. Eisenhower as President of the United States and held a meeting in Bermuda in the hope of convincing Eisenhower to hold summit talks with the Russians after Stalin's death. This meeting, which was also attended by the French, was more of an exchange of views. Eisenhower was pleased when the Russians agreed to a phased withdrawal of British forces from the Suez Canal, and this led to new hopes of cooperation. Churchill, who resigned his post on April 5, 1955 due to ill health, retained his membership in the House of Commons and was re-elected as an MP in the elections held in 1959. In the meantime, he published his important four-volume work, History of the English-Speaking Peoples. On April 9, 1963, he was made an honorary American citizen by the American Congress. On January 24, 1965, Churchill died in London and was buried with a state funeral.